It was a muggy night in Newark. The local bar was full, a casual hangout for those looking to relax after a long day. He was there, sitting at the counter, just another calm customer, drinking a cold beer and enjoying his moment of peace. The atmosphere was friendly, without confusion, until two police officers walked through the door, immediately changing the atmosphere. They looked around with that typical air of authority, but one of them, the tallest one with a hard face, focused his gaze on a single point, the man sitting at the counter. A black man. That cold look, full of prejudice, already betrayed his intentions. He walked towards the man with slow steps, full of superiority. For him, the presence of that man there was enough to create a story in his head. "You there, get up," the policeman's voice echoed through the bar, breaking the murmur of conversations. The man looked at him, surprised but not moving. He knew what was happening. I had been through this before, but I still couldn't believe it was happening again. "What is happening?" he asked, without raising his tone, remaining calm. "I'm just having my drink." "I'm ordering you to get up now," insisted the policeman, anger beginning to show. Everyone in the bar watched in silence, their gazes turning to that scene. The man, not wanting to create confusion, stood up slowly, trying to remain calm. "Why are you approaching me? I didn't do anything." He kept his voice firm, but the discomfort was evident on his face. The officer completely ignored the question, grabbing his arm tightly and starting to pull him towards the exit. "Documents. Now," said the other police officer, who watched the scene with a mixture of indifference and complicity. The man let go of the officer's arm and began looking for his wallet, still trying to understand the gravity of the situation. He handed over the documents without offering resistance. But the policeman didn't even look at the papers properly. His decision had already been made. "Let's go. You're going to get out of here now." He said this with disdain, pulling the man out of the bar. "Wait. What did I do?" asked the man, now confused and frustrated. "I'm just here like everyone else. I didn't do anything wrong." "Wrong?" The policeman gave a bitter smile. "Being here is already wrong. I don't need anything more than that." The words went through the man like a blow. Those few sentences carried a weight he knew well. It was racism, pure and blatant, masquerading as authority. The injustice was explicit, and the public humiliation made every second seem like an eternity. He looked around, seeing the faces of the people in the bar, some empathetic, others just looking away. But nobody did anything. Nobody said anything. "You are making a mistake." He tried to argue, his voice now firmer, feeling like he needed to say something, defend himself in some way. "Shut up and get in the car." The police officer pushed him towards the police car, without paying attention to the protests. His wrists were cuffed before he could argue any further. The cold feel of the metal against his skin brought silent anger, but he maintained control. "I knew that any wrong move could make the situation even worse." He was just another black man, being treated like a criminal, for no apparent reason. Inside the car, he fell silent. I knew that explaining it there, at that moment, wouldn't change anything. The two police officers laughed among themselves, satisfied with the power they had over him. For them, it was just another night at work, a normal day at the police station. They didn't even bother to think that maybe they were making a serious mistake. As the car drove away from the bar, the man looked at the floor of the car, feeling the tension growing. He knew he couldn't stay silent forever. Something would have to happen. It wouldn't end like this. But at that moment, not even the police officers knew they were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. The humiliation the man suffered there was just the beginning. What would come later, when they discovered who he really was, would change everything. And when the truth was revealed, someone would pay the price. But who? How would this error be corrected? The only thing that is certain is that that would not be the end. Before we begin this story, we want to make it clear that the plow of twist is against any type of racism or discrimination. We believe in equality and respect for all, and this channel supports causes that promote justice and dignity for the Black community. We know that the fight against prejudice is a daily reality, and that is why we continue to bring stories that inspire, reflect, and make you think. Now, enjoy this powerful narrative, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity to do so now. Good story. Marcus Freeman has always believed in justice. He spent most of his life dedicated to it, growing up in a poor neighborhood in Newark, where he often saw more abuse of power than protection. From an early age, his worldview was shaped by the harsh reality he faced. He saw childhood friends being stopped by the police simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or, as they used to say, for being too Black. For Marcus, this was not a fate he was willing to accept. He grew up with a sense of responsibility and justice, something that made him dream of changing that scenario. That dream led him to the FBI. Working hard, he excelled in training, always striving to not just be a good agent, but to be the best. He knew that, as a Black man, he would need to prove his competence twice as hard. And that's exactly what he did. He climbed the career ladder, earned the respect of his colleagues and became a reference, especially in complex cases involving corruption and hate crimes. Still, despite his success, Marcus was not immune to the injustices of the world around him. Not even his badge could protect him from what many insisted on calling reality. After years of relentless service, Marcus finally took time for himself. He was on vacation, something rare, and chose to spend a night at a bar in a neighborhood he had known since childhood. It was a place that mixed working people, old residents, and some new figures. The bar owner, an old acquaintance, greeted him as soon as he entered, with a smile that conveyed familiarity. The atmosphere there has always been peaceful, a refuge from daily challenges. Marcus felt at home. Sitting in an inconspicuous corner of the bar, Marcus watched the people around him, slowly drinking his beer. I was content to just be there, without the pressure of work, without the complexities of the cases. That night, he wanted to forget that he was an FBI agent. I just wanted to be Marcus, the man from Newark, the one who survived all the hardships to be where he was now. But the tranquility of that night would be short-lived. Across town, Officer Garrett Collins was also finishing his shift, but with a completely different feeling of satisfaction. Garrett was the kind of cop who took pride in the uniform he wore, but for all the wrong reasons. For him, the badge was a symbol of power, of control. He did not see his position as a responsibility to serve, but as an opportunity to impose his will on others, especially those he considered inferior. He carried deep prejudices, something he learned from his father, also a police officer, who always said that certain types of people didn't belong in certain places. The Collins name was already known on the Newark police force, and Garrett used this to his advantage. He knew that no matter what he did, there would always be someone to cover for him, someone to make sure his little slip-ups didn't become public knowledge. Many at the police station were suspicious of his behavior, but no one had the courage to confront him openly. He was always seen as a ticking time bomb, someone who would eventually do something irreversible. When Garrett and his partner, young officer Ryan Matthews, got the call for a routine patrol in that area, Garrett immediately took control. He knew the area and, for him, it was the kind of place where people like him needed to be careful. It was an area where many blacks and immigrants frequented, which automatically, in his mind, meant trouble. The tension was already palpable in the patrol car when Garrett spotted Marcus sitting at the bar, apparently too calm for his liking. "That one," Garrett murmured, fixing his eyes on Marcus. "What's a guy like that doing in a place like this?" Ryan looked where his partner was pointing and shrugged. To him, it was just another patrol, and Marcus looked no different from other patrons at the bar. But Garrett didn't think so. He felt a mixture of disdain and anger rising within him. "Let's see what he's running from," Garrett said, with a bitter smile, ignoring Ryan's indifference. When they entered the bar, the sound of conversations quieted. There was something about Garrett's posture that made the people around him uncomfortable. He approached Marcus like a predator circling its prey. Marcus, feeling the gaze, raised his head and looked at Garrett without any sign of fear, but with a clear expression of tiredness. He already knew how it would end. "You there, get up," Garrett ordered, his voice firm and full of authority. Marcus looked around. No one else was called, no one else was questioned. Just him. "Why?" he asked, his voice controlled. "I didn't ask any questions." "Get up now," Garrett repeated, his patience running out. Marcus, not wanting to cause a scene, slowly stood up. He had been through similar situations in the past. He knew Garrett's racism like an old scar that never really healed. "I knew that if I protested, this could quickly get out of hand." "I want to see your documents," Garrett said, looking at him with clear contempt. Marcus sighed and handed over his wallet. Garrett barely glanced at the documents before throwing them back on the table. "And what are you doing here? This doesn't seem like the kind of place for guys like you." The words loaded with prejudice and humiliation were said in a tone of someone who already knew the answer. Garrett didn't care who Marcus was. In his eyes, he didn't belong there, and that was reason enough to approach him. Marcus, for a moment, considered revealing who he really was, showing his FBI badge, and ending this humiliation. But something held him back. Maybe it was the tiredness of always having to prove your worth. Maybe it was the silent anger that was growing inside him, an anger that he had learned to control for years. He preferred silence. Ryan, the young police officer, watched the scene with discomfort. He knew Garrett was exaggerating, but he didn't have the courage to intervene. Garrett had always been like this, and Ryan, new to the force, felt he had no right to question someone so experienced, even when he clearly saw the error. Still, something inside him twisted with indignation. He knew this was wrong. Garrett, on the other hand, was increasingly satisfied with his authoritarian stance. He placed his hands on Marcus, turning him roughly and handcuffing him for no valid reason. The entire bar watched in silence, a mixture of fear and resignation in people's eyes. "Let's go," Garrett said, pushing Marcus towards the exit without any consideration. Marcus, with the handcuffs tightening his wrists, felt humiliation rising within him. He had already been through so much in his life, so many moments when racism tried to crush him. But this time, there was something different. He was no longer the neighborhood kid. He was someone who could do something about it, and he knew this story wouldn't end there. The way to the police station was silent, but inside Marcus, a decision was already being made. The police car drove through the streets of Newark on that sultry night, with only the sound of sirens drowning out the heavy silence between the three men in the car. Marcus, sitting in the back seat, watched the buildings pass by through the fogged window as sweat slowly dripped down his forehead. His hands were still cuffed, and the discomfort of the tight metal chains was beginning to irritate his skin. The FBI agent, who had experienced so many risky situations throughout his career, now found himself in a humiliating position, for no reason other than the color of his skin. Garrett, the officer behind the wheel, drove with visible satisfaction. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as if he were controlling something larger than the vehicle itself. Every second seemed to increase the feeling of power he felt for having put that man, who for him was just one more, in the car. Beside him, Ryan, the young police officer, was tense. He could barely hide the discomfort he felt about what had just happened at the bar. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't right. "You know what I hate, Ryan?" Garrett broke the silence, with that smile of someone who is about to say something venomous. "I hate it when they think they can do whatever they want, that they can go wherever they want, as if there were no rules." Ryan swallowed hard, without responding. He knew he couldn't agree to that, but he also didn't have the courage to confront his more experienced partner. Garrett had a reputation for being ruthless, and Ryan didn't want to risk his position. But as Garrett's words filled the car, Ryan's conscience grew heavier and heavier. He felt they were about to cross a line from which there would be no turning back. "What is it, Ryan?" Garrett asked, now with a more aggressive tone. "Are you going to be quiet or do you have something to say?" Ryan hesitated, quickly glancing at Marcus in the rearview mirror. The man was silent, looking at the floor of the car, as if he was trying to disconnect from reality. The young policeman took a deep breath and replied, in a low voice, "I have nothing to say." Garrett gave a short, dismissive laugh. "That's right. Nothing to say, because you know I'm right. They have to learn their place, and if no one does that, chaos ensues. Look at him, all quiet now. I bet that there in the bar he thought he could challenge us, show these papers as if he owned the world. But here, in the back seat, he's just another one." Marcus listened to every word. He felt the hatred in Garrett's words, but he remained calm. He had learned to control his emotions over the years. "I knew that the time to act was yet to come." Being silent did not mean being defeated. Inside him, the tension was rising, but he used it to his advantage, preparing himself for what was to come. He had been underestimated before, and that always ended up being his biggest advantage. The car finally arrived at the police station. The place was silent, like most nights, but the heavy atmosphere was still present. Garrett got out of the car and pulled Marcus ungently, taking him straight inside. Ryan followed them, increasingly restless. The feeling that it was about to explode in some way was almost palpable. "Sit down," Garrett ordered, throwing Marcus onto a chair in the interrogation room. He released the handcuffs abruptly, but kept his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. "Do you want to tell me now what you were doing there in the bar?" Garrett asked, trying to sound casual, but the contempt was still present in every word. Marcus looked at him calmly and crossed his arms. "I already said I didn't do anything. Was just there having a drink." "Just having a drink, huh? And why were you so defensive when we approached you?" "Defensive?" Marcus finally looked into Garrett's eyes, his tone now firmer. "I showed my documents, I did what you asked. You were the one who got aggressive." Garrett gave a cold smile, running his hand across the metal table between them. "And you think this will work for me? Show documents and speak softly? Do you think you're going to convince me that you were just there, doing nothing?" The atmosphere between them was tense. Ryan, who was watching from a corner of the room, began to sweat. He knew that Garrett was provoking, trying to get a reaction from Marcus to justify this absurd arrest. But Marcus remained unshakable. "Look, Garrett," Ryan tried to intervene, his voice hesitant. "Maybe we should just check his file, you know. He gave the documents, we can do this quickly and..." "Shut up, Ryan." Garrett snapped, not even looking at his partner. "I know what I'm doing. I don't need a newbie telling me how to handle cases like this." Marcus watched the interaction, sensing that things were about to escalate. Garrett was on a personal crusade, driven by something beyond his role as a police officer. The power he wielded was not the power of an agent of the law, but that of someone who needed to humiliate to feel superior. And with every word he said, Marcus knew he was dealing with a man who had lost control over his own humanity. But Marcus also knew that, at that moment, he had an advantage. Garrett still didn't know who he really was. To Garrett, he was just another black man picked up in a bar, unimportant, with no history. Marcus felt the badge in his jacket pocket, heavy as ever. At any moment, he could take that away and change the game. But he waited. "I knew it needed to be at the right time. So, are you going to tell me or not?" Garrett knocked on the table, leaning closer to Marcus. "Are you going to continue pretending you didn't do anything?" "I've already told you what you need to know," Marcus replied, his voice controlled. "Now, the rest depends on you." The sentence made Garrett walk away, slightly confused. He didn't know if it was a provocation, a veiled threat or just another form of resistance. The silence in the room was dense. Ryan, in the corner, was visibly nervous, looking from side to side as if he expected something to fall apart at any moment. Garrett approached again, this time calmer, as if he had decided something. "You want to know? Let's resolve this once and for all. I'm going to make a call and find out who you really are." He left the room with an air of victory, leaving Marcus and Ryan behind. Ryan looked at Marcus, discomfort written all over his face. He knew Garrett was exaggerating, but he didn't have the courage to confront him. He got a little closer and said, almost whispering, "Dude, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to do that. I don't agree with that." Marcus looked at him, saying nothing for a moment. He could see that Ryan was different. Still new to the job, he seemed like someone who hadn't been completely consumed by the system. "You have a choice, you know," Marcus replied, with a serious look. "You can do something different." Ryan lowered his head, not knowing how to respond. The truth that Marcus said hit him, but he was still trapped by the fear of confronting his partner. Outside, Garrett was making his call. But what he was about to discover would change the course of that night irreversibly. And when he knew the truth, it would be too late. Garrett returned to the interrogation room with a cynical smile on his face, still full of the arrogance he had carried since the beginning. For him, it was all just another night at work where he had the chance to show his power. Upon entering, he threw the chair aside with force, making a loud noise that echoed in the small room, as if he wanted to mark his presence. Marcus, who was sitting at the table, kept his gaze fixed on the officer, without saying a word, waiting for Garrett's next move. Ryan, leaning against the wall, observed the scene in silence. He knew the situation was getting complicated, but he didn't know exactly what to do. His partner had already crossed the line and something was about to fall apart. The weight of responsibility suffocated him, and the tension in the room seemed to grow by the second. "Let's get this over with," Garrett said, leaning across the table and tapping his fingers against the metal. "I made some calls. I asked them to take a look at your file, and do you know what they told me? Nothing. Nothing relevant. It looks like you are a ghost." He smiled, expecting to see some reaction on Marcus's face, but found only silence. Marcus kept his expression firm. He knew Garrett was bluffing. "I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and it would change everything." But he also knew that now was not the time to reveal who he was. "Not yet." Garrett continued, leaning in further, almost touching his face to Marcus's. "So, what are you hiding? Who are you really? Because so far, all I see is a guy who thinks he can sit at a bar like he owns the place. But here, you're just another liar." The last word came out of his mouth full of contempt. Marcus didn't respond right away. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension in the air building. He knew that, at that moment, his calmness was irritating Garrett more than any words could. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but full of authority. "Maybe you're looking in the wrong places," Marcus said, with a slight tone of defiance. Garrett gave a short, dry laugh, clearly disconcerted that he couldn't break Marcus. He banged his fists on the table impatiently. "Are you challenging me? Are you kidding me?" Garrett shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the room. Marcus remained firm, without changing his posture. He knew that Garrett's temper was becoming more and more of a problem for him. And the more brutally the police officer acted, the more Marcus was sure he didn't need to do anything. Garrett was digging his own grave. Ryan, who up until that point had not said anything, finally decided to intervene. He knew he needed to speak up before this escalated further. "Garrett, I think we've done enough for today. We must let it go. We have nothing against him." Ryan's words came out hesitantly, but he knew he was saying what needed to be said. Garrett turned to his partner, his eyes full of anger. "Are you serious? Are you really on this guy's side now?" Garrett was in disbelief, his voice louder than necessary. "It's not about being on his side," Ryan replied, trying to remain calm. It's about doing what's right. We have no reason to keep him here. Garrett was silent for a moment, studying his partner with a mixture of anger and betrayal. He wasn't used to being questioned, much less by someone younger and less experienced. His hand trembled slightly at his side, as if he were trying to contain his own fury. He knew something was out of control, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Marcus, in turn, carefully observed the dynamics between the two. He knew this was his chance. He knew the kind of man Garrett was. I knew that he only respected power, and that the only way to turn the tide was to reveal who he really was. But he also knew that, at that moment, Garrett was so consumed by his prejudice that, even when faced with the truth, the police officer would not back down. Garrett, Marcus said calmly, attracting the officer's attention again. I gave you every chance to do the right thing. But it seems like you're more concerned about your ego than the truth. Garrett laughed, his laugh dry and full of disdain. True. He repeated. There is no truth for people like you. There is only what I say there is. And now, I say you will stay here until I decide what to do with you. The smile on Garrett's face began to fade, giving way to an expression of frustration and anger. He approached Marcus again, this time pulling his jacket roughly. The sound of tearing fabric filled the room for a moment. And it was then that Garrett saw what he hadn't expected, the FBI badge, pinned to the inside of Marcus's jacket. For a second, time seemed to stop. The silence in the room was deafening. Garrett looked at the badge, then at Marcus' face, and back at the badge. His expression changed from arrogance to pure disbelief. He dropped his jacket as if he had just touched something toxic. That's false, he said, but his voice no longer had the same confidence as before. Ryan approached slowly, looking at the badge and finally realizing the magnitude of what they had done. He turned pale, not knowing how to react. Marcus, still calm, raised his voice, this time more firmly. It's not fake. I'm Marcus Freeman, FBI agent, and you've just made a very big mistake. The impact of those words seemed to resonate in Garrett's mind like an endless echo. His breathing became more rapid, and he began to visibly sweat. What was once a cruel joke for him, an exercise of power, now turned into a nightmare. He knew there was no easy way out of this situation. That can't be, Garrett stammered, taking a few steps back. Like you. Marcus stood up slowly, now without the handcuffs that Garrett had removed. He straightened his jacket and looked directly at Garrett without looking away. I warned you, Garrett. I gave you the chance to do the right thing. But now, there is no going back. You thought you could humiliate me, you thought I was just another guy you could step on. But you were wrong. And you will pay for it. Ryan, still processing what was happening, looked at Marcus with wide eyes. He knew his career could be ruined because of that night, but he still wasn't sure what his next step would be. Garrett, on the other hand, was panicking. He had completely lost control of the situation and, for the first time in his life, realized that his badge would not save him. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He was paralyzed by fear. Marcus glanced at Ryan and said, his voice firm but not angry. Ryan, you have a choice to make. You can decide whether you're going to stay on his side, or whether you're going to do the right thing. Ryan hesitated. He looked at Garrett, who was motionless, unable to react, and then looked at Marcus. Finally, with a deep sigh, he took a step back. I'm going to do the right thing, he said, his voice shaky but determined. Garrett, seeing that he was completely alone, fell into despair. Ryan, you can't do this. He shouted, his voice now filled with fear. You're going to ruin everything. Do you know what this means? Ryan shook his head, tears in his eyes, but didn't respond. He knew he had no choice. The silence that followed Ryan's decision was heavy. Garrett looked at his partner as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The panicked expression on his face showed that he finally understood the size of the mistake he had made. The distant sirens of the police cars outside echoed through the police station, creating even greater tension in the air. Garrett tried to speak, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He knew his career, and possibly his freedom, hung in the balance. Marcus remained standing firm, with an almost frightening calm. This was the moment he had been patiently waiting for since it all began. He had control now, and Garrett, who had for so long abused the power he believed he possessed, was now vulnerable, exposed. The badge that once seemed like impenetrable protection was now worthless in the face of the truth. "Garrett," Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm not a vindictive man, but what you did here today won't go unnoticed. I gave you chances to back off, to stop this before it was too late. But you chose to continue. Now, there's no going back." Garrett, still in shock, took a step back, leaning against the wall, as if trying to find a way out of a nightmare of his own making. The reality of the situation was finally starting to sink in his mind. It was no longer just a matter of arrogance or blatant racism, now, it was about the consequences of his actions. And he wasn't prepared to deal with them. Ryan, still shaken, looked at Marcus, seeking some form of guidance in the FBI agent's calm gaze. He knew that, from that moment on, his life would also change. He didn't want to be part of that. He didn't want to be complicit in something so grotesque, but he knew that his silence until then put him dangerously close to being so. "What do we do now?" Ryan asked, almost in a whisper, looking from Marcus to Garrett, as if waiting for someone to answer his question. He looked like a young man lost in the midst of a moral storm he never expected to face. Marcus stared at Ryan for a few seconds, evaluating the young officer, and replied, without hesitation, "Now, you do the right thing. Report what happened here. Write everything down. Every detail." Garrett let out an incredulous, almost hysterical laugh, interrupting Marcus. He shook his head, as if he still couldn't believe what was happening. "Are you kidding me? Report? Do you know what this will do to us? It will destroy our careers, it will destroy my life." Garrett shouted, his voice wavering between fear and anger. Marcus remained motionless, unfazed by Garrett's emotional outburst. "It's going to destroy your life, Garrett. You did this to yourself. And with all due respect, I don't care." Marcus looked directly into Garrett's eyes, the coldness in his words was not one of cruelty, but of justice. "You built your career on humiliating and stepping on people you thought were beneath you. But today, you stepped on the wrong person." Garrett stayed silent, swallowing the truth Marcus had just thrown in his face. His eyes filled with fury, mixed with despair. He was surrounded, and the reality that there was no way out began to crush him. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor that took over his hands. He looked at Marcus with a mix of gratitude and fear. "I knew that even if I did the right thing now, I would be marked by it forever. But I also knew that I couldn't live with the guilt of remaining on the wrong side of history." "I'll do the report," Ryan said, his voice shaky but firm. Garrett, desperate, took a step towards his partner, eyes wide, in complete panic. "You can't do this, Ryan. I protected you, I taught you everything." Garrett shouted, his voice now cracking. "You won't destroy me like that. You know what they're going to do to me." Ryan, with a heavy heart, looked away from Garrett. That was the moment things finally changed for him. He could no longer live in the shadow of what Garrett represented. With a deep sigh, he replied, "I'm not going to protect you, Garrett. Not this time." His words were low, but full of conviction. Garrett backed away again, now completely collapsed. The image of a powerful police officer, of someone untouchable, had been destroyed before his own eyes. The power he had used so much to oppress others had turned against him, and now he was the only one helpless in that room. Silence once again dominated the environment, and Marcus, knowing that this was the decisive moment, walked slowly to the door. He knew he had already done what was necessary. The system would take care of the rest. It was no longer his responsibility. But before he left, he turned one last time to Garrett, who was slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. Ryan, standing next to the table, watched his partner with a sad expression. Marcus spoke calmly, but with a tone of finality. "Garrett, you can even try to escape the consequences, but justice always finds its due. It doesn't matter how long it takes." With those words, Marcus left the room, leaving behind the chaos that Garrett had created. In the police station corridor, he took a deep breath. The tension he had been carrying inside since the beginning of that night was finally beginning to dissipate. He knew that although justice was slow, she had begun to act. The walk out of the police station was silent. Outside, the Newark night was still warm, but now Marcus felt the weight of what had just happened. He knew it wouldn't end there. There would be investigations, interrogations, and Garrett and Ryan's names would be on the official reports. But he also knew he had done his part. The humiliation he had suffered, the prejudice that had suffocated him during those hours at the police station, would now turn into a lesson that would echo for a long time. As soon as he reached the sidewalk, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed a familiar number. On the other end of the line, a professional voice answered. "This is Agent Marcus Freeman, FBI. I need you to send a team to the Newark police station immediately. I have a case of abuse of power to report." The call was brief but decisive. He knew the system would now take care of the rest. While waiting for his coworkers to arrive, Marcus looked up at the Newark sky. There were no stars that night, just the heavy darkness of a city he knew so well. But for a brief moment, he felt a small victory. Not for himself, but for every person who, like him, had been wronged by people like Garrett. That night would be remembered as the moment when an ordinary man, with a badge and a sense of justice, stood up to the system, and won. Now that the truth had been revealed, Marcus knew his work was just beginning. And as he waited, he reflected on the weight of responsibility he carried in being not just an FBI agent, but a symbol of resistance for all who, like him, were once treated as invisible. The night was thicker when Marcus finally walked away from the police station. Inside, the chaos he had left behind began to unfold, and the wheels of justice slowly came into motion. The words he had spoken to Garrett still echoed in his mind, not with the flavor of personal revenge, but with the weight of an inescapable truth. Marcus knew what happened that night was bigger than him. The humiliation and injustice he suffered were reflections of something much deeper, a system corrupted by decades of prejudice and abuse of power. As he walked along the deserted sidewalk, he pondered his next steps. The FBI would be called to investigate what happened, and he knew that Garrett Collins' name would be marked in official reports, forever associated with abuse of power. But this thought did not bring him satisfaction. There was a tension, a kind of moral dilemma that had accompanied him since he set foot in that police station. Yes, Garrett would pay for his actions. But what about Ryan? The young police officer who, although complicit to some extent, had shown contrition and a sincere desire to do the right thing. Ryan, in his hesitation, placed himself at a crossroads. He wasn't like Garrett, that was clear to Marcus from the beginning. The young officer was caught between his loyalty to his partner and the sense of justice that still fought to survive within him. Now, as Marcus walked, he couldn't help but think about the implications of what was to come. Ryan would have a difficult choice ahead of him: tell the whole truth and, in doing so, possibly ruin his own career, or remain silent and carry the guilt for the rest of his life. Marcus knew the weight of a decision like this. Throughout his FBI career, he had seen many men and women facing similar dilemmas, some choosing the easy way out, others choosing to follow their convictions, even if it destroyed them inside. He himself had been placed in situations where following protocol meant abandoning the sense of justice he had carried with him since he was a child. But he always knew that once he crossed that line, there would be no going back. Now Ryan was walking that fine line, and Marcus knew the young officer would need more than just courage to make the right decision. He would need support, something that Marcus, as much as he wanted it, couldn't offer directly. It was a path Ryan would have to travel alone. Inside, the police station was silent but charged with tension. Garrett remained sitting in the chair, motionless, his face buried in his hands. The man who, minutes before, displayed a posture of absolute power, was now unrecognizable. The fall was quick and devastating. He knew that even if he tried to cover up what had happened, the evidence was against him. Marcus Freeman's badge, the FBI on his tail, and the truth itself that could no longer be hidden. Ryan, standing next to the table, watched Garrett with a mixture of pity and fear. He was still processing everything that had happened. The shock of discovering that the man they had arrested was not just a private citizen, but an FBI agent, had hit him like an avalanche. But, more than that, the weight of his own choices that night began to suffocate him. He knew he would have to give a detailed report on everything that happened, but now, facing Garrett, he felt the pressure of the dilemma that consumed him. "Ryan," Garrett murmured, his voice hoarse and full of despair. "You can't leave me like this. We are in this together." Garrett's words were a plea, but also a veiled accusation. For Garrett, Ryan was always the loyal partner, the one who didn't question, the one who followed orders without hesitation. And, in a way, that was true. Ryan had followed Garrett into many situations that now, in hindsight, seemed wrong. But tonight had been different. When he saw the FBI badge, something inside him changed. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew Garrett was trying to manipulate him, just like he always had. But this time, the impact of the truth was too strong to ignore. "Garrett," Ryan began, his voice wavering but honest. "I can't do this anymore. Not after what happened here today. You've crossed a line that I can't cross with you." Garrett lifted his head, his eyes red and watery with frustration. He was losing everything, and reality hit him like a blow. For the first time in a long time, he had no control over the situation. "Are you going to hand me over? Are you going to screw me like that? After everything I've done for you?" Garrett asked, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. Ryan shook his head, a weight in his chest that seemed unbearable. "I'm not going to lie, Garrett. I can't lie anymore." He looked at his partner, and for the first time, he realized how much he had allowed Garrett to shape him, to take him down a dark path. Garrett stood up suddenly, slamming his hands on the table. "Do you think you're being fair? Do you think this is black and white?" Garrett shouted. "There is no such thing as fair in this job, Ryan. Do you think they'll thank you for screwing me over? They will finish you off too." Ryan backed away a little, feeling the weight of Garrett's words. He knew there was truth there. Even if he did the right thing, he would pay the price. The system had its own rules, and even those who chose honesty could lose out. But he also knew he couldn't live with himself if he let what had happened go. "I'm not going to cover for you, Garrett. This is over," Ryan said, more firmly now, feeling like he had finally made a decision. Garrett, his eyes swollen with angry tears, punched the table once more before sitting down, defeated. He knew there was no way out. He knew that Ryan, his last ally, was now on the other side. Outside, Marcus was still waiting. Time seemed to drag by that night, as if every minute was a reminder of the consequences that were yet to come. He knew that the path to full justice was long and full of obstacles, but at that moment, a small victory had already been achieved. Garrett Collins, the man who had humiliated him and tried to use him as a symbol of his power, was now about to face the consequences of his actions. Ryan's dilemma, however, continued to loom over Marcus. He knew that the line between good and evil was not always clear, especially when it came to a system that often protected those who abused it. Ryan was stuck in this moral dilemma, and Marcus knew he would have to live with the choices he made. While reflecting on everything that happened, Marcus saw the lights of FBI vehicles approaching. It was time to face the consequences. The sound of FBI vehicles cut through the air, filling the silent street outside the Newark police station. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows, creating moving shadows. Marcus watched as his classmates got out of their cars and walked toward him. He knew that from that moment on, the final pieces of the night would begin to fall into place. The system, flawed as it was now in motion, and Garrett Collins would have to face the consequences of his choices. Inside, Garrett remained sitting in the chair, completely defeated. His hands were still shaking, and his empty gaze revealed the extent of his despair. He had spent years believing that the power he possessed was absolute, impenetrable. But now, the same system he used to abuse people like Marcus was about to turn him inside out. He knew he would be investigated, that his career, and probably his freedom, were hanging in the balance. The badge he used so much to oppress others was now worthless. Ryan, on the other hand, was standing next to the table, with a heavy heart. He watched Garrett fall apart, but unlike his partner, he felt a deep, silent relief. He knew that doing the right thing wouldn't make him a hero, that his own career would still be at risk, but the truth was on his side now. He had made a difficult moral choice, and living with it, challenging as it was better than carrying the guilt of being complicit in something so cruel. Ryan knew he would need to answer for his hesitation that night, but at least he could look in the mirror without feeling ashamed. "Collins, get up," said one of the FBI agents who had entered the room. The firm voice broke the silence of the police station. Garrett lifted his head slowly, his eyes red with frustration. He knew there was nothing left to do. He knew his actions had led him to exactly this moment. When the officers handcuffed him and took him out of the room, the entire police station fell silent. The sound of the cuffs on his wrists was a symbol of slow but inevitable justice. Garrett Collins, who had used his power so much to harm others, would now face the consequences of his own arrogance. Outside, Marcus watched as Garrett was loaded into the squad car. The two men's gaze met for a brief moment. There was no vengeance in Marcus's eyes, just a calm certainty that balance had been restored, at least for tonight. Garrett looked away, unable to bear the weight of the truth staring him in the face. For him, this would be the end of everything he had built, a fall he had never predicted, but which was entirely deserved. Ryan came out soon after, without handcuffs, but with a serious expression. He knew that his career was at stake, that even if he reported the truth, he would not come out of the situation unscathed. He would have to face the harsh reality of his choices, both the mistake of having followed Garrett there and the courage of finally doing the right thing. Marcus approached Ryan, and the two men exchanged a silent look. There was no need for words at that moment. They both knew the road ahead would be complicated, but justice had been served in a way they would never forget. "You did right, Ryan," Marcus said calmly, placing a hand on the young officer's shoulder. Ryan sighed deeply, relieved, but still with the weight of the night on him. "I hope that means something," Ryan replied, his voice tired but sincere. Marcus nodded. He knew that for Ryan, this was just the beginning. But he also knew that the young man had taken a step in the right direction. Not everyone can redeem themselves so soon, and Ryan, at least, had chosen the right side of the line. Garrett was tried by the local court and was arrested for abuse of authority and hate crime. A few days later, Marcus Freeman was back at work. The Newark police station was still undergoing an internal investigation, and FBI agents had already discovered that Garrett Collins was involved in a series of abuses that, until then, had been covered up. Ryan had been suspended pending the conclusion of the case, but was already cooperating with the investigation, reporting everything he knew. Marcus, in turn, returned to his daily life as an agent, but the experience of that night would never leave his memory. He knew he hadn't won a personal battle. He knew that story was about something much bigger than him. What happened at that police station was a reflection of a constant struggle that many men and women face every day. Justice, for Marcus, was never about revenge or superiority. It was about balance, about doing what is right even when the system seems flawed. And that night, he had proven to himself that maintaining his integrity was the only path worth taking. As he walked through FBI headquarters, he felt the weight of his badge in his pocket. That badge wasn't just a tool of power, like Garrett had used it. For Marcus, it represented something much more important, the responsibility to fight for those who cannot defend themselves. To ensure that abuse of power did not go unnoticed, and to keep the flame of justice alive, even in the darkest situations. This story is not just about a man being unjustly imprisoned. It reflects what so many people, especially in the black community, face daily: prejudice, discrimination, and the ongoing fight against a system that often fails to protect those who need it most. Marcus Freeman is not a hero because he is an FBI agent. He is a hero because he chose, even in the face of injustice, to maintain his dignity, face racism with serenity and, above all, believe that justice is something worth seeking. What about you, viewer? What would you do in Ryan's place? Would you do what is right, even knowing you could suffer the consequences? This story reminds us that the choices we make, even the most difficult ones, define who we are. It's easy to stay silent, but the real challenge is to stand up against what is wrong, no matter the cost. If this story made you reflect, if it brought you some emotion, we invite you to subscribe to the channel Tales of Twist. Here, we seek to tell stories that impact, that bring lessons and that make you think. Don't forget to leave your comment and share your opinion, every reflection counts. Until the next story.